The wind has a voice out here. Most nights, it's a lonesome whisper that combs through the pines, a sound I've come to know as the only steady companion a man like me can count on. But tonight, it had a different tongue. It was a vicious thing, a blade that scraped against the log walls of my cabin, seeking any crack to tear its way inside. The weight of winter was a physical presence, a bruising cold that pressed down on the roof and on my soul. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 45 years old, though the grief I carry makes me feel a century older. It's been 3 years since I buried my Eleanor, and in that time my world has shrunk to the size of this cabin. It's less a home now and more a museum to a ghost. Her shawl still hangs on the peg by the door, a splash of faded blue against the dark wood. I imagine it still holds the scent of her, of lavender and wood smoke, a ghost I refuse to exorcise. The herbs she'd gathered hang in brittle bunches from the rafters, their purpose long since faded. My life is in stasis, just like them. In the nearby town they call me the quiet man. I suppose it's true. Words have felt like a currency I can no longer afford since Eleanor. And before her, the small, silent daughter we never got to hold. I go to town for salt and flour, offer a nod where a greeting is expected, and retreat to my solitude. The world had taken enough from me. I saw no reason to offer it anything in return. That's why the sound was so unwelcome. It was a sharp, scraping noise from outside, followed by a muffled thud that was too soft for a falling branch and too heavy for an animal. I tried to ignore it, to blame it on the wind's fury, but it came again, a desperate, scratching sound against the wood of my porch steps. Annoyance stirred in me, a cold and bitter thing. Whatever it was, the wilderness could have it. But then, a third sound, a low moan, so faint it was nearly swallowed by the gale. It was human. Against every instinct I'd cultivated for 3 years, I pulled my rifle from its rack, lit the lantern, and unbolted the door. The wind tore it from my grip, slamming it open against the cabin wall. A vortex of snow and ice swirled into the room, and there, in the lantern's unsteady glow, was a huddle of dark fabric collapsed at the edge of my porch. I stepped out, the cold a physical blow. It wasn't just a huddle, it was a person. A woman. She was lying face down in the snow, one arm flung out as if reaching for the door. Her dress was dark, torn at the shoulder and stained with a deeper blackness I knew was blood. But it was her feet that stopped my heart for a second. They were bare, already turning a deep, angry blue against the pristine white of the snow. For a moment I stood frozen, the man I'd become warring with the man I once was. The quiet man would have shut the door. He would have let the winter claim her, another soul lost to this unforgiving land. It wasn't my business, but the man who had held his wife's hand as she slipped away, the man who had once been a war medic and knew the precise cost of a moment's hesitation, that man couldn't turn his back. With a curse that was ripped from my lips by the wind, I knelt, setting the lantern down. I slipped my arms under her, expecting a weight that wasn't there. She was light, fragile as a bird. As I lifted her, her head lolled back, and the firelight from the open cabin door caught the sharp, proud line of her cheekbones and the intricate beadwork on her torn collar. I carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm's fury. I laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the only place of warmth in the entire cabin. As the heat began to thaw the ice from her dark hair, I saw her clearly for the first time. She was young, her face etched with exhaustion and pain, but it was unmistakably the face of the people. Comanche. It had been years, a decade maybe, since any of them had been seen this far north. Their lands were to the south, their presence here a long-faded memory. A tremor of unease, colder than the wind, ran through me. Sheltering a half-frozen traveler was one thing. Sheltering a Comanche girl, wounded and alone, was another entirely. It was an invitation for a kind of trouble I had spent years trying to escape. I had just cracked open my door to the world, and I had no idea what I had just let in. The medic in me took over before the man had a chance to second-guess himself. I stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows across the room, and fetched the chest where I kept my old supplies. War teaches a man things he prays he'll forget, but the body never does. My hands, which had grown stiff with disuse, remembered the deft, practiced motions of cleaning a wound. I cut away the torn fabric of her dress around her upper arm. The gash was deep and clean, not the ragged tear of an animal's claw, but the slice of a knife. As I worked, washing it with carbolic soap and water, I could feel her eyes on me. They were dark, narrowed to slits of obsidian, watching every move I made. She was conscious, but she lay perfectly still, a statue carved from pain and sheer will. When I brought out the suturing needle, she didn't flinch, didn't even breathe a word. Her breathing was the only sound besides the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, a steady rhythm of endurance. I stitched the wound closed, my movements efficient and detached, and wrapped it in clean linen. The entire time, we exchanged no words. There was only the silent, heavy awareness of two strangers bound by a wound and a storm. The next morning, the storm had not broken. If anything, it had thickened, burying the world in a shroud of white. When I rose, she was already awake, sitting up on the bearskin rug, her back straight and her gaze fixed on the fire. Her good hand rested on the bandaged arm, a protective gesture. I moved about my morning routine, stoking the fire, making coffee. The silence was an entity in itself, a third presence in the room. I ladled some leftover stew into a bowl and set it on the floor a few feet from her, along with a tin cup of water. My voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. "You're safe here," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I hesitated, then added the truth. "For now." She looked from the food to my face. I expected gratitude, perhaps fear, but I saw neither. Her expression was one of pure animal caution, the look of a fox caught in a trap, assessing the man who holds the key. She didn't touch the food until I had moved to the far side of the cabin to mend a harness, putting a safe distance between us. We spent the day in that tense, silent cohabitation. The storm raged outside, locking us in. The cabin, my sanctuary of solitude for 3 years, felt both smaller and more alive. After a long while, she rose slowly and picked up the small broom by the hearth. With quiet, deliberate strokes, she swept the ashes and wood chips I'd let accumulate. Then she took the rough wool blanket I'd used to cover her the night before and folded it into a neat square, placing it at the foot of the rug. They were small acts, simple chores, but they were a statement. She was not just a helpless patient. She was creating a space for herself within mine, a fragile domesticity that unsettled me more than her silence. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing. I woke near midnight to a sudden stillness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in a deep, breathing darkness. The woman was not on the rug. My hand went for the rifle before I saw her, a silhouette standing by the single window, staring out into the white maelstrom. The snow was so thick, there was nothing to see but a swirling void, but she watched it with an unnerving intensity. I rose from my cot, my bare feet cold on the wood planks. "What are you looking for out there?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence for a long moment. She just kept her vigil, watching the horizon that wasn't there. My unease sharpened into a cold certainty. I'd brought trouble into my home, and it was coming. "Are you expecting someone?" I pressed, the question hanging in the air between us. This time she turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see the line of her profile in the dying glow of the embers. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She gave a single, definitive nod. The gesture was small, but it landed in the quiet of the room with the force of a slammed door, confirming every fear I hadn't dared to name. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world born anew in a blinding expanse of white. The silence it left behind was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. It was a deceptive peace. I pulled on my boots and coat, needing to see the state of my world. When I opened the door, the air was so cold and clean, it was like swallowing a knife. and then I saw them. Chele, the snow, so pristine a moment ago, was a ruin. It had been churned into a dark, muddy chaos by the hooves of countless horses. They formed a near-perfect circle around my cabin, a perimeter of violation that made the hairs on my neck stand up. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I hadn't heard a thing. They had come like ghosts in the dying storm. Payur. My gaze lifted from the ruined snow to the ridge that overlooked my small valley. And there they were. They were silhouettes against the pale dawn sky, a silent, waiting army. At least 50 or 60 of them, mounted and motionless, their lances stark lines against the morning glow. They were as still as the granite of the ridge itself, a line of stone and flesh and lethal intent. I could see the faint vapor of their horses' breath mingling with the cold air, the only sign of life in the imposing tableau. The woman's nod last night had been a warning. This was the consequence. A soft footstep on the floorboards behind me made me turn. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket, her face pale but resolute. She looked past me, up to the ridge, and a flicker of something, not fear, but a deep, weary sorrow, passed through her eyes. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet heedless of the cold wood, and stood beside me. At the head of the war party, one figure was larger than the rest. He wore the pelt of a great gray wolf, its head resting over his own, its snout pointing to the sky like a grim banner. He nudged his horse forward, and it began a slow, deliberate descent down the slope, the other warriors remaining perfectly still. As he drew closer, I could see the power in his frame, the unyielding authority in his gaze. He was a man who did not ask for respect, but commanded it by his very presence. The woman beside me took a small, sharp breath. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and clear, the first words I had ever heard her speak. "Father?" The word hung in the frozen air, changing everything. This wasn't a raid for supplies or retribution for some imagined slight. This was personal. This was a reckoning. The man, her father, halted his horse a dozen yards from my porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. He stood there, the wolf cloak making him seem more than human, and his eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on me. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, the air so thin and sharp it hurt to breathe. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over me, my cabin, and then his daughter, before landing on me again with the force of a physical blow. "You sheltered her," he stated. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, heavy with unspoken threats. Before I could form a reply, before I could decide whether to reach for the rifle I'd left inside or stand my ground with empty hands, the woman stepped forward, planting herself between us. She faced her father, her chin high. "I was wounded, and he gave me aid," she said, her voice stronger now. Then she added the words that sealed my fate. "I chose not to return." Her father's gaze shifted from me to her, and for a fleeting instant, the hard mask of the chief cracked, revealing the pained face of a father. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He looked back at me, measuring me from head to toe as if weighing my soul. He saw my solitary cabin, my worn clothes, the exhaustion etched into my face. I met his stare, my own life of loss having burned away any capacity for fear. There was nothing left in me to be afraid of. "You have 3 days," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Return her to my care by then." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "After that, I will not come as a father seeking his daughter. I will come as a chief for what is mine." With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back up the ridge without a backward glance. The line of warriors turned as one, a silent, fluid movement, and disappeared over the crest, leaving behind nothing but the trampled snow and the echo of a threat more powerful than any storm. The ultimatum hung in the air long after the last warrior disappeared over the ridge, a poison that seeped into the very logs of my cabin. 3 days. It was both a lifetime and no time at all. The silence that returned between us was different now. Before, it had been a wall of caution and mistrust. Now it felt like a shared space, a fragile territory we were both afraid to disturb. On the first day, we moved around each other with a new, somber awareness. The shadow of her father's return loomed over every small act. She no longer seemed like a trapped animal, but like a person who had made a desperate choice and was now living with its weight. Late in the afternoon, as I was mending a tear in my coat, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, tentative. What was her name? I looked up, my needle poised mid-stitch. She was nodding toward the faded blue shawl on the peg by the door. The question was so unexpected, so direct, that it broke through the fortress I had built around my heart. No one had asked me about Eleanor in years. No one had dared. Eleanor, I said, the name feeling like a precious, dusty thing I'd taken from a locked box. She nodded. A small gesture of acknowledgement, and a thread of understanding was woven between us in that moment. She hadn't asked for my story, just the name. It was a small but profound intimacy, a recognition that the cabin was filled with more than just my ghost. The next day our communication began to flow not through words, but through deeds. I found a soft piece of deer hide I'd been saving and left it on the table for her, along with a sinew and an awl. Hours later, I found her working it into a small pouch, her fingers moving with a practiced skill that spoke of a lifetime of such tasks. In return, I found my scattered tools arranged neatly on the workbench, the hearth swept cleaner than I'd ever kept it. It was a language of action, of mutual respect. That evening, as the light faded, she sat by the fire and began to sing. It was a low, humming melody, a lullaby that was both mournful and beautiful, and I found myself pausing to listen, captivated. In the quiet that followed, I heard myself speaking, sharing a fragment of my past I hadn't spoken aloud in years. I was a medic in the war. That's how I knew how to stitch her arm. On the morning of the second day, I knew I had to go to town. Our supplies were low, but more than that, I needed a new tunic for her. The torn dress was a constant reminder of her flight and her wound. Facing the town was a trial of its own. As I expected, our arrival at Gable's Mercantile caused an immediate, suffocating silence. Every customer stopped to stare. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose opinions were as sharp as the vinegar she sold, peered at us over her spectacles. "Elias," she said, her tone dripping with disapproval. "Some company's not always good company, you know. There's a wildness in some people that can't be tamed." She whispered the last part, but it carried across the silent store. A hot flash of anger, an emotion I thought had died in me, surged through my veins. "She's not company, Martha," I said, my voice low but firm. "And her name isn't some people." The woman beside me stood a little taller. I bought flour, salt, and a length of sturdy blue cotton fabric, feeling the burn of judgment on my back the entire time. That night, the final night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. The next dawn would bring her father, and with him, a violence I didn't know if I could survive. We sat by the fire, the blue fabric lying folded on the table, a promise of a future that might not come. I don't know why I did it, but I told her about my daughter, about the tiny, perfect hands that never curled around my finger, the silent cry I never heard. I spoke of the hollowness she had left, a wound that had never closed. When I finished, the silence was absolute. Then, I felt a small, warm hand cover mine. It was a simple, profound gesture of comfort, an understanding that passed between two people who knew the language of loss. In the deep, quiet darkness, with only the embers for light, I felt a shift inside me. The weight of grief I had carried alone for so long felt, for the first time, shared. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the fire's dying glow. "Kaya," she said. Dawn broke on the third day with a cold, brutal clarity. There was no fog, no lingering storm to soften the edges of the world. Everything was sharp and defined, including the line of warriors cresting the ridge. This time there was no hesitation. They descended into my valley not as ghosts in the snow, but as a resolute force, their horses' hooves, a rhythmic thundering drumbeat that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin and up into my bones. Chief Matto and his warriors didn't circle the cabin this time. They formed a solid wall across the field, a living barricade of horseflesh and hardened men, their faces painted for a battle they fully expected. The morning sun glinted off the tips of their lances and the barrels of their rifles. This was not a threat. It was a promise being fulfilled. I took my rifle from the rack, its weight a familiar but grim comfort in my hands. As I stepped onto the porch, Kaya was right beside me, her presence a silent declaration. She wore the new tunic I had bought for her, the simple blue cotton a stark contrast to the beadwork of her past and the war-ready assembly before us. She refused to be a prize to be claimed, a piece of property to be reclaimed. She stood as my equal, facing the tide with me. Chief Matto dismounted, his wolf cloak, a fearsome mantle in the morning light. He strode forward, stopping at the same spot as before, the ground between us feeling like a battlefield already consecrated by tension. His eyes were hard as flint, fixed on me. He had come not as a father but as a chief. But before he could speak, Kaya stepped forward, her voice ringing out in the cold air, clear and strong. She spoke to him in her own tongue, a rapid, passionate flow of words I couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. It was the sound of a daughter confronting her father, of a woman claiming her own life. When she finished, she turned back to English for my sake, for the sake of the moment. "I will not be traded like a hide or a horse," she declared, her gaze unwavering as she met her father's. "I would rather stay with a man who saw me before he needed me to be anything." Her words struck a chord in the formidable chief. I saw it in the slight softening of his jaw, the flicker of conflict in his eyes. He looked from his defiant daughter to me, the quiet man in a worn coat holding a rifle he clearly didn't want to use. He saw the new tunic she wore. He saw the way she stood beside me, not behind me. He saw the bond that had been forged in the crucible of 2 days, and a shared silence. He saw something other than a kidnapper and a captive. A battle would be simple. A massacre, even simpler. But a chief's duty is to his people, and a father's heart is to his child. He was both, and they were at war within him. Finally he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "A man's worth is not in the strength of his arm, but in the honor of his spirit." He looked me up and down, a new kind of assessment in his eyes. He was no longer measuring a threat, but a man. "There will be no battle today. There will be a trial." He proposed a traditional hunt. It was a test of skill, of respect for the land and the life it holds. It was a way to prove my honor, to show I was worthy not of possessing her, but of protecting the choice she had made. It was a challenge I could not refuse. "I accept," I said, the words tasting of fate. He gestured for 2 horses to be brought forward. I left my rifle on the porch and mounted the offered pony, its back unfamiliar beneath me. We rode out, the chief and I, leaving the silent warriors and Kaya behind. We tracked a young buck for over an hour, moving through the pines in a silence that was not hostile, but focused. He was testing my patience, my knowledge of the woods. When the time was right, he handed me a bow and a single arrow. A rifle was for a soldier, a bow was for a hunter. I stalked the deer, my breath held tight in my chest. I waited for the clean shot, the one that would grant a quick and respectful death. The arrow flew true. When we returned to the cabin with the kill, the warriors watched, their expressions unreadable. Chief Matto dismounted and walked to his daughter. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture heavy with a sorrowful pride. He spoke to her softly in their tongue, then looked at me. "You have honor, Elias Thorne," he said. He then turned back to Kaya. "You are no longer of my fire, but you are not gone from my heart." He gave a sharp command. The warriors turned as one and rode away, their departure as swift and silent as their arrival. As they vanished over the ridge, the sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, began to cloud over. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came down in earnest as the last warrior disappeared over the ridge. A soft, steady rhythm on the roof of the cabin. It was a gentle sound, a stark contrast to the thundering hooves and the silent scream of tension that had filled the valley moments before. The rain seemed to wash the world clean, blurring the sharp edges of the trees and turning the churned-up snow in the field to a soft gray slush. It was washing away the scent of war, the residue of the confrontation. Inside the cabin, the quiet that fell between us was different yet again. It was no longer the silence of caution, nor the heavy silence of impending doom. This was the quiet of aftermath, the profound stillness that follows a storm. The air felt lighter, breathable. The weight of the last 3 days, which had settled on my shoulders like a physical burden, finally lifted. Kaya stood by the open door, watching the rain fall. I stood by the hearth, the warmth seeping back into my chilled bones. The space between us was no longer a chasm of uncertainty, but a calm and open field. I had faced down 70 warriors, but the next words felt more daunting than any battle. "If you had chosen to go with him," I began, my voice steady, "I would have let you. You know that, don't you?" It was important she knew. It was important I knew. The trial, the hunt, it wasn't to win her, it was to honor her choice. She deserved a life rooted in her own will, not one dictated by my rifle or her father's authority. She turned from the door, her dark eyes meeting mine across the room. She held my gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between us that spoke more than words ever could. In her eyes, I saw the journey she had taken, from the wounded girl in the snow, to the wary captive, to the defiant daughter, to the woman standing before me now, entirely her own. With the freedom to leave laid bare before her, with the path to her people now open and unopposed, she finally made her choice clear. She took a step toward me, then another, closing the space between us. "I want to stay," she said. The 3 words were simple, yet they landed in the center of my hollowed-out life and began to fill it. I want to stay. It wasn't a declaration of need or a plea for shelter. It was a statement of desire, a choice made freely and with full knowledge of what it meant. She was choosing this quiet, isolated life. She was choosing me. A feeling I hadn't felt since Eleanor was alive bloomed in my chest. A tender, painful, and overwhelmingly precious thing. Hope. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and gently touched her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. It was the first time I had touched her out of necessity or care for a wound. This was different. This was a question, a confirmation. My reply was just as simple, just as profound. "Then stay." She leaned into my touch, a small, trusting gesture that undid me completely. I lowered my head, and she met me halfway. Our first kiss wasn't one of fiery passion or desperate relief. It was quiet, soft, and anchoring. It tasted of the rain and the wood smoke from the fire. It was a kiss of deep, unspoken trust, a seal on the bond we had forged in silence and trial. It was the beginning of a new language between us, one that we were only just starting to learn. The next morning, the world outside was clean and dripping, the sun breaking through the clouds. The future, which had been a terrifying void just a day before, now felt like an open road. We had faced her past. Now we had to face mine. "I need to go to town for supplies," I said. "You should probably stay here. It'll be easier." Kaya was lacing a new leather tie into her moccasins. She looked up at me, her expression firm. "No," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We will face them together." She chose to ride with me, not as a woman I was sheltering, but as a partner. As we saddled the horses, I knew this next trial, the one of whispers and judgment, would be just as telling as the one on the ridge. But this time, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The ride to town was different this time. Before, Kaya had been a silent figure beside me. a mystery wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Today, she rode tall, her back straight, the blue cotton tunic a quiet statement against the dark leather of the saddle. We rode side by side, our horses' steps falling into a steady rhythm. We were a united front, and though we didn't speak, our presence together was a message to anyone who cared to look. As we neared town, I could feel the familiar tension coil in my gut. This was a battle of a different kind, one fought not with lances and rifles, but with narrowed eyes and poisoned whispers. It was a kind of conflict I had always avoided, finding it more draining than any physical fight. But with Kaya next to me, her calm resolve a palpable force, I found a strength I didn't know I had. She wasn't afraid, so I couldn't be either. As expected, our arrival at Gable's Mercantile brought all activity to a halt. The handful of customers and Mrs. Gable herself froze, their eyes locking onto us as we stepped through the door. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. I could hear the silent questions, the assumptions being made. I placed my list on the counter, the sound of the paper slapping against the wood unnaturally loud in the silence. Mrs. Gable peered at Kaya, her gaze traveling from the new tunic to the intricate moccasins on her feet, before landing on me. Her lips were pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "Well, Elias," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the quiet. "I see your arrangement is continuing." The word arrangement hung in the air, ugly and insinuating. It reduced everything, the storm, the wound, the trial, the choice, to a sordid transaction. Before I could form a response, my anger rising like bile in my throat, Kaya spoke. She stepped forward slightly, her posture calm and her voice clear, without a trace of anger or shame. "I am not an arrangement, Mrs. Gable," she said, her gaze steady and direct. "I am a woman who chose." The simple, powerful dignity of her words stunned the room into a deeper silence. She hadn't been defensive, she had been definitive. She had claimed her own story, her own agency, right in the heart of their judgment. Mrs. Gable, for the first time since I'd known her, looked flustered, unable to form a reply. She busied herself gathering my supplies, her movements jerky and abrupt. The other customers suddenly found the floorboards or the contents of their baskets intensely interesting. We gathered our things, flour, coffee, more fabric, this time a warm wool, and paid our due. The transaction was completed in a tense, formal quiet. As we turned to leave, I knew this was the moment. I could walk out, having weathered the storm, and let the whispers fester in our wake, or I could burn them away with the truth. I stopped at the door, turned back to face the silent store, and looked at each person in turn, ending with Mrs. Gable. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, carrying to every corner of the room. "We'll be married come spring," I announced. The words rippled through the room like a stone tossed into a still pond. Jaws dropped, eyes widened. It wasn't an explanation or a defense. It was a quiet declaration of intent, a promise that transformed their sordid assumptions into a simple, respectable future. It silenced the gossip more effectively than any argument ever could. Faction. We walked out into the sunlight, leaving the stunned silence behind us. The ride home was peaceful. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light over the valley, bathing the world in a warm, forgiving glow. The storm of judgment, the one I had feared far more than Chief Motto's warriors, had been faced, and we had weathered it together. As we rode, I glanced at Kaya. A small, gentle smile touched her lips, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that we were finally on our way home. The declaration in town was a turning point. Spring arrived, and with it, the thaw. Just as the snow melted away to reveal the green shoots of new life beneath, the cold frost of prejudice in town began to recede, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. We were married by a traveling preacher, a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin with the pines as our only witnesses. There was no fanfare, only a quiet promise that felt more binding than any law. In the weeks and months that followed, Kaya and I built a new life, weaving our two worlds together thread by thread. Our shared silence, once a barrier, became a comfortable and eloquent language. It was filled with the easy rhythm of shared tasks, the quiet joy of mutual presence. We became each other's teachers. I taught her how to shoot my rifle, her eye proving far steadier and more patient than my own. She, in turn, taught me the subtle arts of the wilderness I had only ever skirted. She showed me how to read the forest floor like a story, to track not just for a kill, but for an understanding of the life that pulsed all around us. The world outside our small valley began to bend toward us. It started with small gestures. One day, Mrs. Gable, with a stiff and formal air, set aside a bolt of calico fabric she thought Kaya might like. It was her gruff, reluctant way of extending an olive branch. The local children, once taught to fear the stories of wild Comanche, started to venture near our land, drawn by a curiosity that outweighed their parents' warnings. They would watch Kaya as she worked with hides or gathered herbs, and she would sometimes share with them a story or a piece of dried fruit, her quiet kindness a gentle dismantling of their fear. Our world wasn't changing them. Our bond was. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Kaya found me on the porch. I was working a piece of pine with my carving knife, the familiar motion a comfort to my hands. The shape was slowly emerging from the wood, the gentle curve of a rocker, the smooth, high sides. A cradle. She stood beside me, watching my hands work. This wasn't for the ghost of the past. It wasn't an act of mourning for the daughter I'd lost, the one whose memory was a constant, dull ache in my chest. This cradle was different. It was for the future. It was an act of hope, a physical manifestation of a belief in tomorrow. Kaya placed a hand on her belly, a gentle, protective gesture. It was still early, but a new life was taking root there. A life born not of obligation or duty, but of a love that had grown in the most unlikely of soils. The man who had locked himself away from the world, who had believed he had lost everything worth having, was now building a future with his own two hands. And the woman who had run from a life that had been chosen for her had found a home, a true home, rooted in a choice that was entirely her own. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her dark hair smelling of pine and clean air. I stopped my carving and wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. We watched the last light fade from the sky, a comfortable silence settling between us. The weight of winter was finally gone, not just from the land, but from my heart. The soil of my life, once hard and frozen by grief, had been softened by the storm and the steady, gentle rain that followed. And here, in this quiet valley, something new was beginning to bloom.